Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, we're joined by Paul Humphreys, who's an associate professor in ecology at Charles Sturt University in the School of Agricultural, Environmental, and Veterinary Sciences. He was here to talk about a recently published article in BioScience entitled Flood Ecology. We had a great discussion about the sometimes uneasy relationship that people have with river floods, as well as some of the ways that we might improve our understanding of them in general, and a whole host of other topics. And one last quick note before we go to the interview. Dr. Humphreys has also very generously offered to share a version of our chat on his excellent podcast, Rheophilia. I'll include a link in the show notes. It's mostly great conversations with freshwater ecologists in Australia. I think you'll enjoy it. Go ahead and check it out right after you're finished listening to this one. For now, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, James.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about flooding and river flooding in particular. And one of the things that I found interesting in the article was the description of a sort of conflicted relationship that humans have with floods. And I was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, look, it fascinates me too. It's one of the things that has really intrigued me for many years. And in fact, I've considered writing a whole book on it at times, and I may still do. It's the realization that most of the sort of cities and towns, and even some of the megacities, you think about Paris and London and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Vienna and you name it around the world. Most of those cities have been settled along a river system of some description, and have probably settled along there because of the benefits supplied by the river system, mostly I would say because of easy access to fresh water, but also initially because of the fertility of the soils alongside the rivers. Egypt's a classic example of where there's not much rainfall in the location of many of the cities, but the Nile provides the water and the flooding which allowed an ancient civilization to rise and exist for such a long period of time. So these cities, these hamlets, then villages, then towns, then cities, then mega cities that grew up alongside their rivers, took advantage of the resources they provided. There's lots more that I could talk about in terms of those resources, but then the conflict becomes, sometimes it starts very early, but because of the relatively small population sizes, it's not so much a problem that people could rebuild fairly small settlements. Again, once the floods have receded, they could move them when the water came in. But then gradually the infrastructure gets more solid, unmovable, and then it becomes a problem because it starts to get seriously damaged by the floods. So it's really this paradoxical sort of conflicted relationship with rivers. We love them, we want to be near them, but they could also cause death and destruction once we start to sort of stay in one place for any length of time.
Yeah, and then that's incredibly tricky too, because the exact reasons why one would want to inhabit such an area is because you've had sediment that's been left there that's enriched the soil, it's good for agriculture, but at the same time, it's periodically underwater.
Yeah, exactly. And the classic example in Australia of this small town called Gundagai, which is not far from where I live. It's a couple of hours north towards Sydney. And the people recognised, the Europeans, I should say, who settled, they settled alongside the river, the Murrumbidgee River there, back in the 1800s. And it was an important place for Aboriginal peoples, First Nations peoples as well. What the First Nations people knew is that the river flooded every so often, and therefore you didn't spend your whole time on the floodplain. But Gundagai built this town on the floodplain, and they had a huge flood. I think it was 1851, 1841. I can never quite remember, which I think killed a third to a half of the residents because they'd decided that they weren't going to move. And in fact, many people were saved by the local Aboriginal peoples. And it was only subsequent to that mega flood that they actually moved the town to above the floodplain, overlooking the floodplain, to avoid such a calamity happening again. But unfortunately, many of our cities haven't done that. I mean, Rome is an interesting example. If you've ever been to Rome, they've built these incredible. The Tiber runs through the middle of Rome, and they've incredible walls. They're built to prevent flooding, but Rome for centuries had major problems with floods. And the thing about floods too is it causes damage. They cause damage initially and kill people initially through drowning. But then often more people die through disease than waterborne diseases afterwards because of the sort of stagnant pools that remain and the flooding of normally sanitary water resources and things. Of course, the Romans made use of water really well, but they still had major problems with flooding. And if you go to Rome now, as I said, you've got these huge walls along either side of the river. It's very, very restrained to try to prevent the Tiber from causing the damage that it used to in the past.
Yeah, and I have to mention at some point in this conversation that our intro music and outro music is When the Levee Breaks from Memphis Minnie and Kansas Joe. And I've been using that for about nearly 10 years now. So it's particularly apt today. But I was hoping we could chat a little bit about the ways that people traditionally deal with this sort of inherently conflicted relationship. Obviously levees, but is it just shoring up, the sides of the river and trying to manage the water flows, and how does that work typically if we can paint with broad strokes?
Yeah, look, pretty much. I suppose the first before major dams were built, levees were one way of doing that. So you provide you increase the height of the river bank, essentially to attempt to limit the flooding. The river has to get to a higher level before it floods. I'm laughing again. I'm laughing sort of ironically. I'm not laughing at the damage and destruction it causes, but it's to me it's a little bit like inflating a balloon larger than it should be. That eventually the bang that it will cause is greater than if you didn't do that, because in most cases levees will overtop, and you can imagine that if you've got people living below on the other side of the levee bank, and you've essentially got waterfalls coming over there and causing more damage than they would have caused probably in the past. So in many cases they prevent flooding for a little while and at sort of moderate flows, but when the flows get too high, they cause more problems than they would have in the past. And a lot of places around the world have built levees to protect cities. And also to protect farmland. Ironically, in Germany there was a big push several hundred years ago to protect land from flooding. So it was draining swamps and actually getting more land for farming, for agriculture. But ultimately, I always say to my students, and they look at me rather strangely now. They often look at me rather strangely anyway, but there was a lovely, I don't know whether in the US you get Doctor Who, this
yes.
television show. Okay. And there was a David Tennant who was Doctor Who at one stage, episode on Mars. And there was a virus that was transmitted via water that sort of seeped into the space station on Mars. And they tried to prevent it from happening. But if you got touched by a droplet of water, you went strange. And David Tennant, Doctor Who, at one stage says, because the water kept getting in, that water always wins. And that's my motto, really, is water always wins. You can do what you like. You can try to prevent it. You can build dams. You can build levees. You can seal things up. But ultimately, water always wins. So fighting against it, in the short term, you might win a few battles, but you'll eventually lose the war. If you look at it as a fight, water will always find its way through, and will, especially in this sort of era of climate change and unpredictable climatic events, that you'll get a bigger flood than you can possibly predict, and it'll cause the death and destruction that it caused and that floods have caused in the past. But because we could only really use our past data on the timing and the recurrence of floods to predict what we're going to get in the future, and that's going to be limited if where it's what we can predict is inherently unpredictable.
Right, and I think I've probably steered us a little too far in talking only about the human element. But I wanted to chat for a moment about, the effects of flooding on ecosystems and their value in that sense.
Yeah, look, floods, to me, and the co-authors of the paper that we wrote, floods are all encompassing in terms of their influence on natural systems, the animals, the plants, all the organisms, but also the actual geomorphology, the physical structure of a river. I mean, it's floods that really define the nature of a river. Again, if I use the balloon analogy, you define a balloon by the amount of air in it. So you blow it up to a certain point, and that's your balloon. You blow up further, and that's your balloon. You let water air out, and that's your balloon, and that's a river. So a small river, by definition, has a relatively small amount of flow going through it. A large river has a large amount of water going through it, and the recurrence interval, the return time of floods, defines the size of the river and the height of the river bank. So most rivers will flood every 2 years. Natural rivers. I mean, some will more frequently, some less frequently, but that every 2 years the river flow will reach the top of that bank, and then it will go over into the floodplain. So floods are the events that do the shaping of rivers. They create the meanders. They cut off parts of the river to create oxbows, and so they provide the what we call the habitat template on which all the animal, plants, and other organisms live. And then, because of flooding going out onto the floodplain, if there is a floodplain, or over those banks, they also influence the edge zone, the riparian zone of plants along the rivers in a big way. They're probably the most important part of it, influencing, and also everything else that happens out in the floodplain. So we tend to think of river corridors now rather than just rivers, because the river corridor includes the main channel, and it also includes the riparian zone, the edge zone, and also includes the floodplain, the broader, in many cases, much bigger area that water will flow into when it goes over the bank. And everything that lives, whether it be a terrestrial animal or an aquatic animal, will be influenced by that flood. So when a flood recedes, that floodplain environment that has had water on it for a while is typically, like I've talked about for agriculture, very useful, but it's also fantastic for terrestrial organisms, because of the sediment goes on there, the water that's been on there, the growth that comes from that, the nutrients in that sediment that enhance growth, which is taken advantage of by terrestrial animals. So you get lots of animals using that during the dry time as well as during the wet time.
Okay, and just talking about river corridors, are there any generalities that we can draw about, their broad scope and scale? Are we talking about something that's 100 kilometers wide or 3 kilometers wide? Are there any sort of generalities that we can draw, or are they all just incredibly varied?
No, well, you can talk about the river channel fairly confidently, that the channel size and sort of relationship between the channel width and the meander length, so the length between the turns in the river, they're very much sort of physically connected. So I think it's about I can't remember what the ratio is, but if you take a little trickle of water that you run down your window, or that you take the Amazon, essentially the width of the stream and the meander length are related. But in terms of the floodplain, no, that's much harder, and that's because there's a lot of geology involved, and therefore, if you've got a river running through a canyon, it can't go anywhere, so it goes up. But if you're going through a sort of a sandy sort of area, it can go much wider. Now in Australia, we have some arid zone streams and rivers, which are, in most of the time, are just isolated water holes with no flow between them at all. Well, at least no surface flow, because often there's water flowing underground, but there's no surface flow. But when you get a big rainfall event happening, those water holes connect up and they overflow and they go out to the floodplain. And in that case, the floodplain can be hundreds, in some cases almost thousands of kilometers wide, and animals take advantage of that by moving between the water holes and moving between whole river systems. So it varies enormously. So there's no magic number that you can say. Some rivers have no floodplains at all. Some have vast floodplains. So the river corridor can be very, very different in different circumstances and different locations around the world. Sorry to disappoint you.
I wasn't expecting generalities, but I was, I appreciate, getting a more of a general idea of at least how it works. I'm curious, the article highlights the need for a flood ecology discipline, and in fact, draws its title from that. What would a flood ecology discipline do? What sorts of things would you study? I imagine some of the things we've already been chatting about, but what difference does it make if it's studied as a discipline rather than perhaps as part of other fields?
Yeah, look, in writing the paper and doing the research for it, I did a fair bit of soul searching, but also reading about sort of what is a discipline, scientific discipline, and whether flood ecology sort of merits that sort of title, that conception. And a discipline really is something where it's a way of hanging your hat on a particular topic to bring together a whole range of often in the past disparate subjects into one under one umbrella. So to recognize that these topics are all related, that they interact, and that they contribute to each other, and that by looking at them as a whole, that they're more than the sum of their parts. So with the flood ecology discipline proposal, we're suggesting there's all this research going on out there. Well, there are two major issues, I suppose. There's a whole lot of research going on, and it has gone on for decades. But it's been done in sort of, to a degree, in silos. So people have been looking at floodplains, but not thinking necessarily about the roles of flood in influencing those floodplain environments. Or they've been looking at in-channel work, or they've been looking at the riparian zones, but not looking at it as a whole. So by having a discipline and defining what can be included in that discipline, and of course that will evolve over time, it allows a more concerted, cohesive approach to the role of rivers, more broadly, but also the role of floods in shaping and the ecology of ecosystems and the evolution of the biota in those ecosystems. But on the other hand, too, is this general negative perception that we sort of alluded to at the beginning of the talk about floods and the damage and destruction they can cause, and they still continue to do that with climate change, and therefore potentially bigger, more frequent floods in some areas, and not in other areas because it's quite patchy in what people will predict. But the problem is that people are actually because increasing populations are actually settling on floodplains more and more than they used to, and in fact where damage occurs more frequently than the past. So deaths are fewer now than they were in the past, but damage of infrastructure is greater, and that's because people are actually making use of those floodplains. So the discipline idea is to bring together scientists working in different disparate parts of pretty much the same field, same discipline, but also to promote floods more broadly, and to try to reframe our view of them as being destructive events that cause the reason why we should care about them is because they cause problems for people, to the fact that they are actually a very positive thing for ecosystems. And if we do change flood regimes, we change the nature of when and how often floods occur, that we risk changing and for in many cases to the detriment of the biota in those rivers.
And you draw in the article a comparison with fire ecology. And I remember growing up as a kid many, many, many years ago, fires were generally seen as nothing other than a bad problem. And now that's been updated, and, perhaps largely as a result of the field of fire ecology's emergence, we have an understanding that fires are beneficial to ecosystems and that allowing periodic burns is a way to avoid worse burns in the future. Is the idea here to do something similar for flooding?
Yes. Yeah. I've got several colleagues who work in fire ecology, and just really interesting to talk to them about how fire ecology is framed versus flood ecology. It's very revealing that it has moved on over the last 50, 60 years or so. As you say, back in the 60s and before that, fires were mostly seen as wholly problematic and just caused destruction and death, like many cases floods are perceived now. But nowadays, fire is seen as a critical part. Now, not to say that Native Americans and First Nations people in Australia and elsewhere have known about fire, the importance of fire, for a very long period of time, and managed and used it over thousands of years to shape their environment for their purposes. But it's taken longer for others, more recent arrivals, to recognise that. But we do now, and in Australia certainly, fire is seen as being a very important part of the ecology of terrestrial ecosystems, but also now much more so the management of them. There's still debate about how fire is used and where it should be used, but it's certainly seen as being an important part of it. We drew that parallel because the fire ecologists and our feeling is that fire ecologists have framed this well over the last few decades and have promoted their ideas and understanding in a more coherent way, and largely achieved their goals, I think. I mean, still a lot to be done, but largely achieved their goals, whereas flood ecology and our analysis of the disturbance ecology literature and looking at the flood ecology versus fire ecology framing shows that flood ecology is a pretty poor cousin of fire ecology at this stage.
And what sorts of things would we, perhaps do, either from a management perspective or from adapting human practices to better accommodate flooding, or to coexist with it in less of a conflicted sort of way? Are there concrete steps we should take, things we should think about? I realize I'm asking you to get out ahead of a new discipline and make recommendations, but I'm curious about what sorts of questions we would be asking and thinking about.
Yeah, well, look, the sorts of questions, there's some fundamental sort of questions really about the roles of floods and flooding on ecosystems more generally, and there are many, many questions that we can ask about that. But if we're thinking about flooding and importance of flooding and how to maintain and manage floods better to provide ecosystem sort of services, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, there is certainly has been a push over the last couple of decades to, rather than to fight floods, and so there's groups of people who've recognised that fighting floods ultimately doesn't work and that water always wins, and therefore nature-based solutions to things like floods have become more popular over the years, and that means not trying to prevent flooding, but to essentially to divert that flooding into ways that it won't cause problems for humans, cause infrastructure damage, to also to make use of that water to provide an environment for native species, and then maybe when it dries up to also use that land for agricultural purposes, for grazing and things. So the utility of not fighting floods but making use of them and diverting their power, because floods have an enormous energy associated with them, can do enormous damage if they do come in contact with solid structures. Humans love to build solid structures and straight lines, which is inherently not a natural thing that you see in the environment very often. that if we can divert that power for good rather than for bad, then everybody wins. The natural systems win, humans win, and we probably will end up saving a lot of money in the process. So it's sort of our flood ecology ideas cover a lot of ground. There are a huge number of dams in the world, more being built all the time. Some are being taken out. Some of the redundant ones are being taken out. But in many cases, those dams do change the nature of flooding in our river systems. And one of the big questions that we pose at the end of the paper that we wrote was, how can we ameliorate the effects of dams, either through sort of managed floods, like they do managed burns, or alternative ways of having flood-like events happen, despite the fact that we've regulated so many of our large river systems in the world. There are different ways of doing that. None of them are particularly, they're not perfect, because dams are built to retain water at times when there's lots of rain, lots of flow, and then released later on, often during drier times and warmer times when the water's needed. So there is an inherent conflict there. But we do need to think about ways of allowing at least a proportion of that water to move downstream at higher levels than we do currently in many cases. Fortunately, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, fortunately, because of course that can cause major problems, is that we can usually, with those dams, prevent smaller and moderate sort of floods, but the big ones, ultimately we can't. Again, water always wins, because there'll be enough rain that the dams will fill up and then spill. And even where I live in Albury on the Murray River, we've had a couple of major floods in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and we've got two very big dams immediately. One immediately upstream from Albury, only sort of half an hour's water flow distance away, and another one much further up. But even those two filled up and then spilled, and there was nothing that could be done essentially except to let it go. And so large proportions of the floodplain, including sort of access to suburbs and things, were cut off because of floods, because there's ultimately, you can't build a dam big enough to hold all that water, which is probably just as well.
That sounds terrifying. I guess the last question would be the climate change question, which is that, are we expecting to face more of these inescapable flooding type scenarios as our weather patterns perhaps are altered by a changing climate?
Look, the science says that in some places there will be more frequent big floods, and in some cases it'll be the opposite. So it depends on which part of the world you're in. To be honest, I can't remember which parts of the world are one and which part of the world the other, but it certainly is not across the board that we'll have more frequent, bigger floods all everywhere. It'll be drier in some places and wetter in other places. And this is, I suppose part of the problem is that we're just not sure exactly when and where and how big these floods will be. I'm a great fan of the idea of anti-fragility. This Nicholas Taleb idea about that you can, that rather than fighting something that ultimately you can't know how big it'll be or how destructive it will be, is to work on the assumption that something bigger and larger and more destructive that will happen eventually, and you don't know when and where, and to work with it in such ways. So floating infrastructure or something that doesn't need to be built on stilts that will ultimately not be tall enough, for example. I'm not an engineer, I don't have solutions, but I do know that that we're entering uncharted territory, and therefore perhaps our our ability to predict and our ability to construct infrastructure that will withstand these types of events are limited. And so probably other ways of thinking about it are necessary, or not. Probably, almost certainly, other ways of thinking about it are necessary.
And it sounds certainly like having a discipline, having a thoughtful way of approaching these questions will be invaluable. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've learned quite a lot. I appreciate it.
Pleasure, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.